already probably Ross's biggest tournament to date in his Magic career. For Brian Braun-Duin, he's one of the last 6 players remaining, and you have to say that's just got to be expected for him at this point. He makes a deep run in what seems to be every tournament he signs up for.
He's done a great job on invitationals, in the Open Series, a 2-time Grand Prix winner, a player who over the last 2 or 3 years has built quite the resume for himself.
All right, well, with that, we are underway. Ross begins the game with a turn 1 Nettle Sentinel. Brian responding with a Ponder, setting up shop a bit here.
I think if you ask Ross, have you lost more matches with Elves to Umezawa's Jitte or every other card in Legacy combined? There's a very good chance the answer is Jitte.
So how important is it then for Ross to get game 1? You have to think for the post-board games, Brian will have that Stoneforge Mystic to go get Umezawa's Jitte.
Definitely. Being on the play game 1 against a deck with no copies of Umezawa's Jitte and only 2 copies of Swords to Plowshares, 2 main deck copies of Pyroblast, Brian's deck's going to get a lot better post-board. So if you're Ross, you really want to get this one.
All right, turn 2. Ross swings in with Nettle Sentinel, plays Quirion Ranger to untap it. Brian drops down to 18. And that is it. It's a very conservative turn 2 from the Elves pilot. We'll go back over to Brian, see what he has in store here. Land for the turn. A lot of counter magic in his hand. Looks like not 1, but 2 copies of Force of Will. Also, Young Pyromancer. That's going to be the play here. He'll get a free elemental with Jataxian Probe.
So we'll see what got sandbagged here. And I suspected that Glimpse would be in Ross's hand, and it is. Usually if your draw is a little bit on the slow side, Ross didn't mulligan. It probably means he's trying to keep some creatures in the holster so he can Glimpse.
Yeah, I was setting up for a big turn 3 here. You see Gaia's Cradle and Glimpse of Nature with 2 1-drops. Ross really hoping for a big turn 3.
Now, Brian with Force of Will in hand, and Ross's hand doesn't do a whole lot else if this Glimpse fails to resolve. It's just creatures.
Now, Ross Merriam actually, in talking about the matchup, said that while it's typically a good matchup for him, the inclusion of Young Pyromancer is actually problematic. It's not a creature he can kill before sideboard, and his plan B, where they just start attacking with creatures, oftentimes Elves uses that to threaten the control player into action. But with Young Pyromancer, Ross really doesn't have that line available.
Exactly. He has to combo through to win once Brian develops a significant board.
All right, and we are underway. Glimpse of Nature for Ross. See if Brian counters, and very quickly he does so, pitching Brainstorm.
Yeah, no hesitation. That's, one of the linchpin cards of Ross's deck, and on top of that, Brian knows the contents of Ross's hand, and it doesn't do very much without that Glimpse.
Ross does still have mana available, though. Gaia's Cradle right now tapping for 3. Ross having 3 creatures in play. 5 total mana available to him right now. I'll go ahead and make Wirewood Symbiote, floating 2 green mana. And you're right, his hand was just a lot of 1/1s for the most part. Those cards like Natural Order, Elvish Visionary, the kind of things that let him really break parity don't seem to exist here.
There are some still very good draws, particularly Elvish Visionary or Green Sun Zenith to go find one. Then with the Symbiote, he can start drawing a lot of cards, assuming that Brian has no removal available.
Well, with his Glimpse countered, Ross plays out most of his hand. This is a second Quirion Ranger in addition to the Symbiote. This does mean if he draws a Zenith or a Craterhoof Behemoth, he probably can just cast it off his Gaia's Cradle.
That's another big draw at this point.
And for Brian, it's just going to be more elementals. Second Young Pyromancer is the play. He passes back the turn, still with another Force of Will in hand. And we talked about the importance of game 1 here. This is becoming a lot harder than I think Ross ever intended this game to be.
He kept a hand that was really leaning on that Glimpse, which is fine, but Brian here with some amount of interaction, even though it's not Umezawa's Jitte, it's still plenty good.
Ross, as we said, they're making all the creatures, went for a Craterhoof Behemoth. That's hard cast thanks to Gaia's Cradle. Brian, that'll get the second Force of Will out of his hand, pitching another Brainstorm. This time, makes 2 elemental tokens now that he has the second Pyromancer.
But Brian's still not really in a position to pressure Ross because the 2/2 is holding off all the 1/1s. Brian's still with plenty of very good draws from this spot. But he doesn't want to wait around too long because Ross still with many very good draws left in his deck.
Yeah, I suppose Green Sun Zenith, more copies of Craterhoof Behemoth, Natural Order. These are all great draws for Ross, so he has a lot of live top decks.
Even Elvish Visionary really can get the ball rolling here.
See what Brian does. He has a swarm of elementals, but he paid a pretty big price for them. Both Brainstorms had to be pitched to Force of Wills in order to keep Glimpse of Nature and Craterhoof Behemoth off the board. And it looks like Brian may start going on the attack here. He has 4 tokens. You're right, he loses 1 to the Nettle Sentinel, but he may be okay with that.
Well, he can't attack with just the tokens. I don't think it makes much sense to cash in a token and deal 3 points of damage at the spot. So if he's going to make an attack, I imagine it's an attack with everything, and that's what you see here.
Yeah, so 2 young Pyromancers, both 2/1 swinging in along with 4 elemental tokens. It's a lot of trading he's offering here. Our Ross could trade any of the elves with a Pyromancer. If not, though, Ross will take 8. That's a lot of damage right now.
I think you're going to see some trading. Young Pyromancer is problematic enough for Ross in the long term that I feel like he has to make some number of blocks there.
Well, it looks like he will take the free block, putting Nettle Sentinel in front of one of the tokens. The question is how many trades he wants to make. It looks to be a lot. Quirion Rangers, they look like they're up for the trade. Maybe not Wirewood Symbiote. He's pretty valuable.
The most straightforward block here is just putting your 2/2 in front of one of the 1/1s and getting whatever you think are the 2 most extraneous 1/1s in front of the young Pyromancers.
Ross goes one step farther. He actually offers the Dryad Arbor for another elemental token, but otherwise makes exactly that block.
Well, he can use the Quirion Ranger to bounce, so it just absorbs 1 point of damage if Ross so chooses.
Right, so I'm not actually offering a trade here, but just preventing damage.
Not necessarily. If you could trade if you wanted to, I'd be surprised if he did. It feels like a little early in the game to be offering a Dryad Arbor for one of the tokens.
Yeah, and Ross blocks. There are tricks, though, in Brian's hand. Swords to Plowshares comes out. This hits Wirewood Symbiote. Brian will get 2 more elemental tokens. And now if Ross wants to use Symbiote to bounce something, he's going to have to do it now. Looks like he'll bounce one of his Rangers, actually. So 1 young Pyromancer will get to live here as the Wirewood Symbiote gets exiled.
I mean, Ross still needs to leave himself with enough resources in a general sense where his big draws are still big draws.
Quirion Ranger bounces the Dryad Arbor. So the net result is that Ross takes 2 points of damage, gains 1 from Swords to Plowshares, but he trades a Quirion Ranger with the young Pyromancer. He eats an elemental token and returns 2 cards to his hand.
So the big question is, can Ross find one of his big draws?
Well, Dryad Arbor will come back down. That gets another mana for Gaia's Cradle. How much more does Ross want to deploy? Taps Cradle for 2. It's going to be Quirion Ranger and Heritage Druid. A lot of mana available for Ross right now. Could have 7 mana next turn. Even more, 8. So if he draws Craterhoof, he can cast it. He would have to tap all his elves to do it, so he wouldn't have that many attackers, but...
Still 1 card left in Ross's hand, which could easily be a mana source.
Elves is capable of creating so much mana off so little. Go back over to Brian with 1 young Pyromancer and still 5 elemental tokens. So he continues to develop his mana base. Now 4 lands in play for him. Still at a relatively healthy 12 life points. He's done a great job of keeping Ross's attacking game plan ineffective.
As you mentioned, with young Pyromancer in play unchecked, it's going to be really hard for Ross to win the game that way.
All right, last card in Brian's hand is a good one, though. For 1 mana, it's going to be Treasure Cruise. That'll get him an elemental and 3 new cards.
That is the card that most of all Ross was hoping not to see.
Yeah, Brian refuel. This will be important here. Spell Pierce. Looks like another Treasure Cruise and Lightning Bolt for the draws.
I mean, that's not the most powerful Treasure Cruise, but it's still plenty fine here. A removal spell, and then most of the way there to casting Treasure Cruise again next turn. He'll have 4 lands and play 3 cards in the graveyard, so mana, Gataxian Probe, or if Ross cooperates and casts something that Brian can Spell Pierce, he gets to draw 3 again next turn.
Looks like he's going to main phase this Lightning Bolt, just continue to make elementals, and really wants to keep Ross's board as small as possible. Deciding between Heritage Druid and Nettle Sentinel, he goes for Nettle Sentinel, and that means all of Ross's blockers are 1/1s, which really clears the way for Brian to continue attacking.
Yeah, the tokens are really freed up at this point, which is, you know, Nettle Sentinel, text box-wise, the most innocuous of all the creatures Ross has in play, but getting out the only 2 toughest creature is better than anything else Brian can do right now.
And that swing is for 7 damage. Ross takes it all, offering no trades. He goes down to 11. And Brian doesn't have him. It's a 2-turn clock with these elementals right now.
And Ross just down to 1 card in hand. Not a lot going on.
He'll just pass back. It is not one of his haymakers. Looking for a Green Sun Zenith, Natural Order, Crater Hoof, something of that magnitude. Even Zenith could be problematic. As we mentioned before, Brian, one of his draws was Spell Pierce.
And a fetch land, oddly enough, at this juncture, one of the better draws for Brian in the deck, as it allows him to Treasure Cruise and have a mana left over this turn.
Yep, so plays the 5th land, immediately fetches it, and I believe you're absolutely right. We'll be seeing another Treasure Cruise that'll cost 4 mana and 4 cards. And get him another Elemental. He's going to do just that, leaving a red up right now.
And the worst case scenario, leaving up a Spell Pierce here is still pretty nice for Brian.
Yeah, hoping for a Lightning Bolt to go with the Spell Pierce. We'll see what his 3 draws are. Second here does hit a Flooded Strand and hits the Lightning Bolt he was searching for. So options for Brian and a lot of pressure. This is a great board for him, and everything will become crashing, and that is 7 Elemental tokens on a Young Pyromancer.
If the Lightning Bolt doesn't kill Ross this turn, it's going to kill him next turn.
If Ross takes all 9 of this, Brian can bolt him, and that is what's going to happen. So game 1, a little bit of a break of serve here. Brian, on the draw, takes the game with Jeskai Stoneblade.
That's a huge win, as now Brian gets to cut out the Pyroblast out of his deck among some other inefficient cards and get a real sideboard, among which is Umezawa's Jitte.
And looking at their sideboards here, well, let's go to Brian's first. You talked about the things that he has in his deck that aren't very good, starting with Pyroblast.
So he has a Containment Priest, 4 copies of Meddling Mage, an Electricity, 2 Flusterstorms, a Pyroblast, 2 Surgical Extractions, a Wear Tear, a Umezawa's Jitte, a Council's Judgment, and a Supreme Verdict. The Supreme Verdict's excellent. The Jitte, as we've mentioned several times, that's going to be coming in as well. The 1 copy of Electricity and the Containment Priest. Those are some real upgrades for Brian in the matchup.
Now, we'll get to Process Board in just a second here, though. One thing we've started this year, which has gotten to be really successful, that's SCG Game Night. If you haven't heard of this, this is run at your local store. It is any tournament, any day of the week, your store can have it be Star City Games Game Night, and you can collect great tokens and pins. They change every month. We now know the January one. This is going to be the Mammoth pin and token. It is a creature type. It's Elephant 3/3 token you see over here on your screen.
We send out new kits every month. This is the January kit. You can head over to starcitygames.com/game night for more information. If you're interested in getting signed up for the February kit, just contact Star City Games, your organized play rep, and they will get you set up.
Yeah, start learning more, starcitygames.com/game night. All right, sideboard. So there's going to be an Umezawa's Jitte in Brian's deck. Now, an interesting story. Brian was thinking about pulling all the Stoneforge Mystics out of this deck when he was going for the tournament, saying didn't think it would be a great metagame for Stoneforge Mystic. And I think in that sense, he's pretty right. It's not been very good.
So you have the control matchups where, for the most part, Stoneforge is not one of your best cards. There's the combo matchups where Stoneforge Mystic is really bad, except when they're creature-oriented combo decks like Elves. And then you have the blue-red Delver decks, or the various shades of Delver, which now with Treasure Cruise, I think Stoneforge Mystic has gotten a lot worse. It's much harder to protect your Stoneforge Mystic, and it's much harder to resolve a turn 5 Batterskull because these Delver decks keep churning through their deck. So I think Stoneforge Mystic has become a lot less powerful now with Treasure Cruise in the format, and a lot of people going to combo decks as a result.
Now, I wasn't able to completely pull the trigger. There are Stoneforge Mystics in his deck, but good news for Ross is it's not a 4 of in his deck. It is just 2. So though Brian gets to board in a Umezawa's Jitte, it's still only 3 ways to find it.
And Brian typically plays with Stoneforge Mystic in all sorts of decks, not just this Jeskai Stoneblade deck, but before that he was making hay with Miracles playing Stoneforge Mystic. Typically what you see is 4 copies, at the minimum 3 of Stoneforge Mystic, alongside Batterskull, Umezawa's Jitte. Sometimes you see a sword in the main deck. Often you'll see a sword in the sideboard. Brian has really de-emphasized that element of the deck. Only 2 Stoneforge Mystics in the list, 1 Batterskull in the main deck, 1 Jitte in the sideboard, no swords. It's really a secondary element of his deck for this tournament.
Now, looking at Ross's sideboard, there's not too much that is great for him here. Progenitus, though, that's something you often see them go to in this kind of matchup.
You often do, though Ross is very conservative about siding in Progenitus. He only wants it for matchups where it's going to be lights out, or he feels there's no chance of assembling critical mass with Critterhoof Behemoth. So, no, given that he's brought it in here, I think that the 3 copies of Abrupt Decay are a must now, especially with Umezawa's Jitte in the deck. Containment Priest is also problematic. I think the 1 Reclamation Sage comes in for the same reason. The 1 Scavenging Ooze is pretty good against a deck that primarily has Bolt for removal and is trying to get to Treasure Cruise. You also might see some of the anti-artifact cards as well, like Pithy Needle and Null Rod, come in.
Yeah. And I guess Brian does, with cards like Supreme Verdict, Brian does have ways to answer something like Progenitus.
It's only one copy, but, I've talked to Ross a lot about his philosophy on Progenitus, and he definitely feels the burden of proof is on you want it for this matchup. If there's uncertainty, he usually leaves it in the sideboard.
Yeah, cards like Containment Priest making it even more difficult.
Correct. And the cost of drawing it. Craterhoof Behemoth is not great to draw in a lot of circumstances in your opening hand, but it is feasible to cast. Progenitus, outside of some extremely unlikely Deathrite Shaman, Birch Lore, Ranger type scenarios, is not something that you're going to be able to cast.
Well, game 2, Ross will get to be back on the play. Remember, he was the higher seed, so he got to be on the play game 1, but very quickly he'll take a mulligan.
So it looks like Brian has brought in his Meddling Mages in this matchup, which I think there's 2 reasons for that. One, Ross is essentially a combo deck, and Meddling Mage is good at answering some specific cards, especially Abrupt Decay. And on top of that, now that Brian wants some more creatures for his equipment, now that he has Umezawa's Jitte, I think he's happier to just play with 2/2s for 2 because he just needs to make sure he has sufficient creatures that in the event that he draws the Jitte or his Stoneforge Mystic gets killed, he has something to put a Jitte on.
Yeah, well, one thing we actually saw last game was the fact that Brian had a lot of creatures in play really did hinder Ross. It was the kind of hand where Ross would normally like to just go on an aggro strategy, and something as simple as a 2/2 for 2 can actually do damage to Ross's attack you game plan.
Yes. Young Pyromancer is definitely the better of the cards as far as that's concerned because the sea of 1/1s is problematic, but I think Brian can take a much more, a red zone approach to the matchup. He can attack a little bit more now with Meddling Mages and equipment that matters in his deck.
Well, game 2 is going to begin a lot like the first. Ross starting out on Nettle Sentinel. This time, Brian just has a land and plays back. And we'll see what Ross can put together. Starts out with a swing, putting Brian down to 18.
We've seen the beatdowns before from Ross. They were not that effective game 1.
Yeah, he was only able to get Brian to about 12 before Brian shored up the ground. And this time it's going to be Elvish Visionary, hoping to untap. He untaps Nettle Sentinel. We'll see if it resolves. Indeed it does. Card for Ross, and we'll be back over to Brian. So Ross may be settling in for a little more card advantage this game. Now with one of the fast combo style draws.
So Brian's got a Bolt in his hand. Neither one of these creatures is a very attractive target, but mana efficiency is also at a premium here. So I think Brian probably passed the turn thinking to himself, I'm going to bolt the most reasonable thing I can bolt, even if it's not an ideal target, and he decides to do that on the Elvish Visionary, making sure Wirewood Symbiote does not become a problem down the line.
Right. If Ross had played Wirewood Symbiote and Brian did not have mana up for it, then Ross would get to bounce the Visionary, netting him an extra card. Too complicated there. Brian just wants to take care of the 1/1 while he can. You see, with Ross's board left to just a Nettle Sentinel, Brian will take the opportunity to ponder here.
So looking at Source of Plowshares and Stoneforge Mystic.
Great 2 cards. Supreme Verdict is also in Brian's hand, so he has plenty of answers left. We'll go back over to Ross. If the game starts going late here, Supreme Verdict, Umezawa, and Stoneforge Mystic should be pretty good at dispatching Ross's strategy.
Brian's got a lot of excellent ways to close the game out once he's stabilized.
So can Ross keep the pressure on? It'll start with an attack. Brian down to 16 from Nettle Sentinel.
And he's got a good amount of removal and counter spells to get him to that point. That's why I thought it was so important for Ross to win game 1, because post-board, Brian's deck becomes a lot tougher to beat.
Well, Ross will go for Green Sun's Zenith for 2. Can he get an Elvish Visionary? Brian will have none of it. It's Spell Pierce that will take care of Ross's play for the turn. He has nothing else and still is just left with the board of Nettle Sentinel.
Brian has done a really good job of, being able to play back on the draw here. He's been very efficient, had something to do on the end of Ross's second turn, had a productive play on Ross's third turn, was able to ponder in the meantime.
And each time after Brian answers Ross's play, he cantrips and then sets up to answer the next one. We see him doing it again. Turn 3, Brainstorm. Does have plenty of lands, but it's just building up to the late game.
He's got an opportunity here to say, all right, here's Stoneforge Mystic. Can you answer that? If not, you're probably dead. And if so, and you can build up a board, then Supreme Verdict takes care of that. He's also got some removal spells to help along the way in case Ross kind of splits the difference, doesn't apply a lot of pressure, but is able to keep Stoneforge Mystic from becoming active.
Yeah, and that's why he's tanking so hard on these lands here, because he knows if he makes Stoneforge Mystic, he's going to have to shuffle them away. So it's not necessarily true that he'll draw both of those again.
He has a lot of control over what his draws look like.
Yeah, plays the third land, does not shuffle though, passes back. Ross swings in again with Nettle Sentinel, putting Brian down to 14, but still with just one creature board. This time he'll untap Nettle Sentinel with Wirewood Symbiote. Does have more mana than he's had in the past, thanks to Gaia's Cradle. Maybe he can get something like a natural order off here.
When Ross played against Reed, Ross was extremely conservative about playing against sweepers. It's a little bit different here because Brian doesn't have nearly the same number. But I wonder how much Ross is going to measure his threats. I feel like probably not that much because he's playing against much more spot removal and the threat of Umezawa's Jitte, which makes the fact that Brian has found his one Supreme Verdict all the more powerful.
Yeah, Ross that turn, Wirewood Symbiote and Quirion Ranger were played. Used the Ranger to untap one of his forests and replay it, having 3 creatures in play now. And I think you're right, and Brian looks like he's headed for a Supreme Verdict. It won't be backbreaking, it'll just be a 2-for-1. Ross will be able to save 1 creature with Wirewood Symbiote.
Well, keep in mind, Ross is already mulliganed, and yes, it may be on the surface a 2-for-1, but first of all, Ross's deck is about building up a critical mass of cards, so his individual draw steps are worth much less than Brian's on average. Also, Umezawa's Jitte is an infinite for 1 if it gets online.
And there is the Return to Ravnica Sweeper. 4 mana, Supreme Verdict, destroying all creatures. Ross can only save 1. He picks Nettle Sentinel, but now the board is clear as we head back to Ross for turn 5. He can do nothing but recast Nettle Sentinel. And it seems like every turn, this is all Ross's board ever amounts to is 1-2-2.
I mean, Brian's draw has just been excellent both of these games. In game 2, that's not really that surprising because his deck is set up to have excellent draws in the matchup. But game 1, that was the one that Ross needed, and the 2 Force of Wills alongside all the spot removal.
And he's done a great job of containing elves, and it has all been without the use of Umezawa's Jitte. Now, Brian may win the game with the card, but it almost seems like he wouldn't need to from here.
If you allow elves to build up a board, they can get through Umezawa's Jitte. He also knows that Ross has removal for Jitte, so it's no lock that it wins the game on its own. So I think he just wants to keep Ross's board completely contained. If he happens to win the game with Umezawa's Jitte, great. But if he can play in such a way that, he has backup plans, I think he'd prefer to do that.
So what will he do? He will Swords to Plowshares, Ross's final creature. It's Nettle Sentinel, Ross with an empty board. And Brian will do a 1-mana Treasure Cruise from there, restocking his hand back up to what I believe is 6 cards. Plays land 5, and he is just out-muscling Ross on resources.
And here's the Stoneforge Mystic, which, again, as you mentioned, out-muscling Ross on resources such that, if this Jitte goes all the way, great. That's winning in easy mode. But Brian has sculpted the game in such a way that it's not a requirement. He can win with bolts and meddling mages and just the backup stuff.
Umezawa's Jitte was the find. He will pass back to Ross, who untaps with 3 lands and an empty board. 1 land not even making mana because Brian has kept all of Ross's creatures off. Once Jitte counters land, this game becomes very difficult for Ross. Down on cards, down on creatures. This is a tough spot for him.
I mean, just look at the raw resource count. Compare mana in play, cards in hand. Even setting aside the structural advantages that Brian has at this point, what's happening on the board, Ross is behind that as well.
Yeah, Ross with no play for the turn. We pass back to Brian. He fetches for land number 6. Gets to untap with a creature in play, a Jitte in hand, and more counter spells to go with it. He seems like he's in firm control as he will make Meddling Mage for the turn.
And I believe this Meddling Mage, if I had to guess, is going to go on Abrupt Decay.
We'll get confirmation of that. But if Brian can protect this Jitte, that will certainly be very hard for Ross. So it does. It goes on Abrupt Decay. Stoneforge Mystic swings in, gets 2 Jitte counters. Ross is left with 1 Reclamation Sage as his only way to answer this Jitte, but he does not have it. He passes back.
Well, he could have potentially brought in the Needle and or the Null Rod. So there are some other ways to get out of this in his deck, but he's drawing very slim at this point.
And Brian comes crashing in here. This is Meddling Mage and Stoneforge Mystic. Just an attack for 3, but more importantly, the Jitte will continue to get more counters. Brian will continue to press his advantage with cards. You see him use these counters to deal extra damage to Ross this turn, pumping Stoneforge twice.
I like getting aggressive here because the other way that Ross can get out of this spot in the event that he, can't get the Jitte off the table is if he has some sort of overwhelming glimpse turn. And Ross is sitting there with a lot of cards in his hand. So you just don't you want to end the game as quickly as possible so there's no hope of Ross glimpsing, playing a million things, and maybe playing over the top of your Jitte.
Well, Brian this turn got to Vendilion Click during Ross's draw step, so we saw what we were waiting on this whole time. It is 2 natural orders, a Progenitus, a Dryad Arbor, Glimpse of Nature, and Elvish Visionary. Progenitus, not the card you want to see in your hand when you have 2 natural orders.
I guess Ross decided he needed to bring this in because of the threat of Jitte. He wanted to be able to natural order for something that could win the game on a low base. But Ross always complains about drawing the Progenitus, and naturally, here we are with his tournament life on the line.
Brian, confident enough, he doesn't want to give Ross another card, doesn't want to risk Ross getting a land because there's nothing in the hand that threatens him right now. The only castable cards for Ross are a bunch of X1s, and there's a Jitte with counters on it in play for Brian.
And now Ross is in the squeeze of, do I need to play my Elvish Visionary because I just need to find action, or do I sit back with it and hope that I can build up some outrageous hand in one turn?
Well, he'll start with Glimpse of Nature. Play Dryad Arbor, and he'll cast Elvish Visionary. This is just using the Glimpse to cantrip. He draws a card from the Glimpse, card from Elvish Visionary. So got 2 new cards from the turn, but that is all. He'll pass. Brian will use the Jitte to take down the Visionary and the Dryad Arbor. Both of Ross's plays for the turn. And a bolt to Ross puts him down to 11. And Snapcaster Mage on Lightning Bolt. That will be it. 11 damage will come back. And Brian Braun-Duin, 2-0. He's your victor. He's on to the top 4.
I suspect that was Ross chucking his Progenitus. If I had to take a guess, probably complaining that he always draws the Progenitus.
For Ross Merriam, a great run. This winning his group on day 1. For him, this has been a great season. He has had some of his best finishes on the Star City Games Opens and a deep run in the Players' Championship for him. He will finish in 6th place, which is a great finish for him. For Brian Braun-Duin, Jeskai Stoneblade has been a great deck for him this year. He's had a bunch of really strong finishes on the Open Series this year, always in contention. Is this going to be the time where